floor to talk about this in the coming days. I actually rise now not on this topic, a topic which affects Virginia significantly, especially sea level rise, but I want to talk a little bit about the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. I do this on behalf of Venezuelans. I do this on behalf of Venezuelan Americans, many of whom live in Virginia, but I also do it on behalf of democracies, because what's happening in Venezuela today demonstrates really just in one country, a global battle between democracies and authoritarian nations. Authoritarian nations are supporting the regime of Maduro, and the democracies of the world are supporting the interim government of President Guaido. And if you want to know, circa 2019, the battle being waged between authoritarians and democracies, Venezuela is a place where you can see it in one country, this global challenge between democracy and dictatorship. The Maduro regime has been destroying Venezuela, which is home to the world's largest oil reserve, and it was once, in recent history, the richest country in all of Latin America. But it's now in full-fledged economic and political collapse, with nearly 80% of the country's population living below the poverty line and more than half of the families unable to meet their basic food needs. The IMF has projected that inflation, right now inflation in Venezuela is 2.7 million%, will grow to 10 million% this year, and most Venezuelans can't even afford one meal a day. Medicines and other life-saving commodities are too expensive for the average citizen to purchase, while Maduro and his colleagues and cronies siphon funds from state-owned enterprises into personal accounts and prohibit humanitarian assistance from entering the country. Infants have starved to death because their families couldn't afford or access formula. Infectious diseases like malaria, measles, and diphtheria that were previously eradicated in Venezuela are emerging as public health system catastrophes. Maduro is using the power of the state to subjugate and repress Venezuelan people. His security forces use detention, torture, and lethal force against demonstrators and political opposition in what both the United Nations and the Organization for American States call possible crimes against humanity. It's provoked a massive refugee crisis. 3.4 million people and counting have made the difficult decision to leave their home because life has become untenable. Many have come to Virginia and to the United States, fleeing two countries throughout the region and creating Latin America's worst refugee crisis, which is worsening by the day. And make no mistake, this is a man-made political crisis in a beautiful nation with beautiful people that has ample resources were it not so poorly governed. In May 2018, Maduro declared victory for a second term in office in an election so flawed that the Organization of American States, the European Union, and the United States refused to recognize it as legitimate. Following months of protests, Mr. President, on January 23rd, the National Assembly, which is Venezuela's only democratic body, determined that Maduro had usurped the office of the president, and in accordance, and this is important, in accordance with the Venezuelan Constitution's provision for succession, the president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, assumed the role of interim president of Venezuela. Again, that was done pursuant to Venezuelan constitutional law. The announcement, which I supported, was swiftly backed by the United States, by the Organization of American States, and over 50 countries worldwide, including most of the democracies of the West. In contrast, which nations are supporting the Maduro regime? Russia, China, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Belarus, authoritarian nations. This is a clear international divide between democracies and authoritarians. We must defend our convictions and bolster the democracies of the world. It's about supporting the Venezuelan people, but it's also about sending an important message globally that the United States remains confident that democracy is the way for people to achieve their hopes and dreams, and when authoritarians try to crush the democratic desires of populations, the United States should be an ally. The United States should never tell another nation who their leaders should be. We have no business in regime change. We support free and fair elections. We support constitutions. That's why I support the current interim government of Venezuela, which has been designated pursuant to the Venezuelan Constitution. I recently met with the Guaidó interim government's representative to the United States. I was encouraged to hear the National Assembly's goal is to move to a democratic system, replacing the interim government with a national government following free and transparent elections, which Maduro has blocked repeatedly. And support for this goal must continue to come from the international community, the Organization for American States, and other democracies. A caution. As a missionary in Honduras in the 1970s, I lived in a dictatorship, in a military dictatorship, and I'm keenly aware of the history and the legacy of U.S. intervention in the Americas. That's why I was very troubled, and I remain troubled, by the Trump administration's threats of military intervention in Venezuela. That would be a massive mistake. The rhetoric is reckless and counterproductive. Our leaders should not be bombastic and inflame a delicate situation that could go in the direction of violence and civil unrest. And in fact, the suggestion of U.S. military intervention actually strengthens the hand of the dictator, because the Maduro dictatorship would like to blame the economic challenges of Venezuela on Uncle Sam or the West rather than their own mismanagement of the economy. The United States should not be making military threats against Venezuela. What we can do, though, is there are many steps we can take that would be appropriate. I support the increase in direct U.S. humanitarian aid for the Venezuelan people as the transition unfolds. It's unbelievable that for years the government has refused to allow humanitarian aid to enter the country to help their own people. The scenes we've seen over the past weekend of roadblocks on highways entering Venezuela and the Venezuelan military fighting to stop humanitarian aid from reaching citizens epitomize the Maduro regime's ongoing disregard for the plight of everyday people. I support the long-needed aid package that will help international organizations provide assistance inside Venezuela, and that interim President Guaidó welcomes, and that former President Maduro should welcome as well. That's why I joined Senator Menendez in co-sponsoring the Venezuelan Humanitarian Relief Act and the Rule of Law Act, and I will support it in reintroduction. I support the United States playing a role in convincing other nations in the Organization for American States to also stand for the people of Venezuela. OAS leadership is very strong, but in the OAS, every member country has one vote. Venezuela has used its petroleum reserves to convince a number of Caribbean nations to back the dictatorship. I think the United States could use very plain diplomacy with Caribbean nations to get them to support the democracy, the current interim government, and we could do that and attain some significant success. We should amplify the pressure we've applied by recognizing the interim government and deploying humanitarian assistance to the border. South America is absorbing 3.4 million refugees from Venezuela, and while the Trump administration condemns the brutality of the Maduro government, but we are reducing our support from refugees from Venezuela and elsewhere. I think the crisis would warrant the extension of temporary protective status to Venezuelans already in the United States. If the Trump administration is serious about helping Venezuela recover from a devastating crisis, it cannot require Venezuelans to return to a deteriorating security situation there. It's not our place to dictate the negotiated terms of a resolution that will end this crisis. That's the role and the responsibility of the people of Venezuela and their representatives. But the United States and the international community should create the right environment for those negotiations to go forward and provide the assistance to allow this transition to occur. We don't want to see greater violence or greater civil war in Venezuela. Interim President Guaidó's offer of amnesty to military and political supporters of Maduro who wish to end their support for autocratic rule is a good step, as is his explicit call for a transitional government and free and fair elections. That role should end. He can remain as a steward until those elections take place pursuant to the Venezuelan Constitution. There is an example in the region. The peace agreement in Colombia signaled the end of 6 decades of conflict. The hemisphere is on a trajectory toward peace with no ongoing hostilities in the more than 30 countries. It's critical that we keep it that way. And finally, in conclusion, Mr. President, during my time in Honduras, I learned a very important prayer that we used to say at mealtime. and it was this: Dios da pan a los que tienen hambre y hambre para justicia a los que tienen pan, which means, Lord, give bread to those who hunger and hunger for justice to those who have bread. I call on this body and our colleagues in the international community to support the people of Venezuela in their quest for both bread and justice. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.